According to a recent survey, there are approximately 380,000 churches in the United States and over 200 million weekly churchgoers. The United States has by far the largest public gathering of Christians weekly than anywhere on the planet. From the nation's founding, Christianity has always been a part of American life. From pilgrims to our currency, modern America has seemingly always acknowledged God. This all began with the Protestant movement known as Puritanism. It started as a Reformation movement, first brought to America by the Pilgrims in the 16th and 17th centuries. The goals of the Puritans coming to America was to have total autonomy from the Church of England. The Puritans didn't believe in the idea of bishops, archbishops, or any church hierarchy. They wanted to do things a little different. They basically removed all traces of the structure of Anglican and Catholic Church. These new Protestant beliefs would go on to guide and form early colonial society. But by the beginning of the 18th century, the zeal that was kindled in the colonies of New England died off. Descendants of the original colonists departed from their spiritual heritage, and with the rise of moral reasoning, their distinct spiritual identity was lost. Deism became a popular belief system and began to spread throughout the colonies. It promoted a focus on observing the natural world without the need of faith. Religion in America was fading. Then, in this month of May, throughout history, came mighty revivals. In 1738, as irreligion was sweeping through the budding colonies of the east coast of America, a great revival was sweeping throughout Europe. It was in this month of May that one of the most electrifying personalities of revival arrived on the shores of America for the very first time. This immigrant was George Whitefield.
According to newspapers, he was an 18th century marvel. Whitfield, as a young boy, would skip school to practice for theatrical performances in Gloucester, England. Trading a stage for a pulpit, he would soon become one of the greatest preachers of the age. He drew inspiration from the teachings of revivalist preachers like Jonathan Edwards and John Wesley. He became a student at Pembroke College in Oxford, England. There he joined a group of Methodists led by John and Charles Wesley that soon became known as the Holy Club. According to his colleagues, Whitfield was an extremely devout student.
In fact, Whitfield was so relentless in his faith and devotion to hear from God that he fasted to the point of affecting his health. After one fast, Whitfield had to be confined to bed for 7 weeks in order to regain his strength. It was that kind of dedication that he carried into his ministry. To say Whitfield was an ordinary preacher would be doing him quite the injustice. It would be like calling William Shakespeare a writer or the Beatles just a band.
Whitfield was ordained as a deacon in the Anglican Church and started preaching in London. As churches began to open their pulpits to this young minister, people started gathering by the hundreds. Whitfield's theatrical training captured the audience and they would hang on his every word. He was quite the draw, but also quite the controversy. In May of 1738, he traveled to America. Whitfield was just 24 when he first set foot on American soil. He came to the state of Georgia and joined the Wesley brothers in their ministry. For 3 months, he preached in Savannah and established the Bethesda Orphanage, the oldest orphanage in America that still stands today. After a few months, Whitfield needed more funds for his missionary journey, so he returned to London to raise money. Word of controversial statements Whitfield made in America spread throughout London. He said that the church's leadership was lifeless and compared them to dead bodies. The churches rejected him, and soon he found himself without a pulpit. The churches refused to book him for speaking engagements.
Since he could no longer conventionally preach inside churches, he took to holding services outdoors independently. Soon, tens of thousands of people would gather to hear him speak. Think like Woodstock or Coachella, where the main stage is not the hottest new band, but rather Whitfield and his fiery preaching. All throughout England, wherever he preached, the crowds would gather.
Whitfield brought the stories of the Bible to life like no one before him. His portrayals of characters were dynamic, and he displayed great emotion both vocally and physically, and enthralled even the greatest actors of his day. The most famous actor in Britain, David Garrick, once said that he would pay a lot of money just to be able to say "oh," like Mr. Whitfield. Even Whitfield's sermon preparation was different from the local priest. Most ministers would fully write out their message and then read it straight from the page in a monotone style voice. George Whitefield gave the stories and message of the Bible depth and meaning like they had never had before.
In his first year of speaking, it is said that his voice startled England like a trumpet blast. Crowds of 20,000 people are recorded to have gathered at his largest meetings. With a population of just 700,000 people in all of England, Whitfield was making quite the impact. He soon became known as the Apostle to the British Empire.
George decided to return to America. Not to Georgia, however, but instead he would tour the American colonies. Whitfield determined Philadelphia would be his starting point. Once again, his popularity grew.
Like the British invasion of the Beatles in the 1960s, this 1739 edition fit the same mold. Large crowds all screaming and crying. However, this audience weren't pushing and shoving to get a glimpse of John, Paul, or Ringo. They were there to see George Whitefield. And everyone, rich or poor, man or woman, wanted to witness firsthand this actor turned evangelist.
$5.14, take one, Mark.
Action. The largest church in Philadelphia wasn't large enough to hold the thousands of people that showed up to it.
Cut. Roll up the largest church in Philadelphia. Ready? Big smile.
The largest church in Philadelphia wasn't... What am I saying? Philadelphia?
Yeah, Philadelphia.
The largest church in Philadelphia. Philadelphia? Sorry, let's do it here.
Action.
The largest church in Philadelphia. Philadelphia? Philadelphia. Psh, bro, I'm from California. That's how we say it there. The largest church in Philadelphia wasn't large enough to hold the thousands of people that wanted to show up to his services. So, just like in London, he moved his meetings outdoors.
In 1739, Whitfield was preaching to a crowd in downtown Philadelphia when the young scientist and a famous religious skeptic, Benjamin Franklin, watched from the crowd. Franklin calculated in great detail that Whitfield spoke to over 30,000 people in a single service. According to the future founding father, the entire crowd could hear Whitfield perfectly clear without any sound amplification. His tour of the colonies became legendary. Newspaper ads announced his appearances, and messengers would ride ahead to spread the word. Before the event, spectators would elbow their way to the edge of the stage, but as soon as he started speaking, the roar of the crowd fell silent.
While his sermons were some of the best entertainment of the day, they also had great impact. Even though his presentations were quite entertaining, according to him, it was never for show. His presentations came from deep convictions that could not be contained. Whitfield's goal was singular: to change hearts. He believed each person must have a conversion experience to be saved, not just an Anglican baptism.
Whitfield's crowds were once again filled with people from all areas of society. He even welcomed slave communities to attend. Some historians refer to Whitfield's outreach to slaves as the beginning of Christianity for Africans in America. Of course, the tour did not go without incident. At a few rallies, unruly mobs attacked Whitfield along with attendees. Whitfield received death threats, and on one occasion he was nearly stoned to death. But despite these hardships, over the course of a 15-month period, it is estimated that 25% of the population in the colonies would have heard him preach.
Whitfield's thunderous voice reawakened a spirit of revival in America that would go on to quite literally shape history. Whitfield started such a spiritual renewal, they began to call it the Great Awakening. One of the most formative events in American history. Whitfield's final sermon on his first American tour was given to a gathering of 23,000 people at Boston Commons. It's possible that never before had someone spoken to that many people at any time in history.
During his tour in Boston, Whitfield spoke at both Harvard and New Haven College, now known as Yale. Historical records of attendees from the events say that the college is entirely changed, and the students are full of God. After wrapping up his 5,000-mile tour of America, preaching more than 350 times, Whitfield decided to take the gospel message to Scotland. Before electricity, microphones, and cameras, in a small town called Cambuslang, thousands of people attended a service that lasted until 2 a.m. Whitfield recalled, "There were scenes of uncontrollable distress, like a field of battle. All night in the fields might be heard the voice of prayer and praise." The following day and into the night, Whitfield preached to around 20,000 people. Then the next morning, they served communion to the crowd with the help of 1,700 volunteers.
George Whitefield crossed the Atlantic 7 times. He became increasingly popular as he traveled back and forth. Any questioning of his manner and methods had completely disappeared. In fact, this pastor became America's first cultural hero. Today, many might not know of his accomplishments for spreading the gospel, but in his time, he was a household name.
It is said that even in his old age, Whitfield continued his tours with the same zeal as when he was younger. His body, however, could not keep up with the pace of his spirit. As his health began to fade, Whitfield would insist, "I would rather wear out than rust out." In his final service, Whitfield emphasized that salvation came through faith, not through works. In one portion, he cried out, "Works? Works? A man gets to heaven by works? I would soon think of climbing to the moon on a rope of sand." That night, hundreds of people responded to his call for salvation. The following morning, Whitfield passed away.
By the end of his life, it's estimated that he would have preached somewhere around 18,000 sermons and preached to nearly 20 million people with his passionate words. All of this before the age of mass media or the internet. George Whitefield was an aggressive evangelist, and although he was ordained as an Anglican, his impact transcended race, class, and denomination. It's said that by his death in 1770, 80% of all Americans would have heard him speak at least once in person. Because of his message and that booming voice, Whitfield was able to unite the colonies with a singular passion that had never been seen before. The unity and passion he inspired throughout his messages ignited the spark for American independence just a few years later after his death. Another influential figure in America's Great Awakening and friend of George Whitefield was a man named Charles Wesley. Despite being often referred to as the Forgotten Wesley, he and his brother John made quite the team. They would go on to co-found the Methodist Church, one of the most influential church denominations in American history. Although his brother John is considered the theological genius behind the founding of Methodism, without the hymns of Charles Wesley, the Methodist movement would have never taken off. In fact, many of the popular hymns sung in church services today were written by the great poet and hymn writer, Charles Wesley.
Wesley wrote, "Hark the herald angels sing, Jesus, lover of my soul, and Christ the Lord is risen today." He composed nearly 9,000 hymns over the course of 50 years. To accomplish this, he averaged 10 lines a day. His brother John became the more well-known of the two missionaries. John was known as a fiery preacher and circuit rider, often passing out pamphlets and missionary tracts on his journey, while Charles stayed mostly in the shadows, writing hymns and music. But many early American historians agree that Methodism would not be what it is today without the hymns of the forgotten Wesley. Charles. The early Methodists were taught and led as much through the hymns of Charles Wesley as they were through the sermons of his brother John. Charles Wesley was the 18th of 19 children in his family. While only 10 of his siblings lived past childhood, his birth was remarkable in itself because he was premature, but he survived. An account of his birth said that Wesley would lay silent, wrapped in wool, for weeks on end until his little body became strong enough to move and cry out. In his early years, it's reported that his mother taught all of the children together for 6 hours a day, teaching them multiple languages. It was through his mother, Susanna Wesley, that Charles learned self-control and study habits in both education and prayer life. He attended Westminster School for 13 years using the language his mother taught him. As a child, Wesley's father spent time in debtor's prison. This had an effect on Charles, leading him to start a prison ministry later in life.
Both Wesley brothers, John and Charles, were educated at England at Christ Church, one of Oxford's largest colleges. Charles's love for music and poetry led him to his calling in writing hymns. Then after 9 years at Oxford, he received his master's degree. At Oxford, Wesley translated Greek and Latin classics into English. It was also there that they formed the Holy Club to celebrate communion on a weekly basis, and along with spiritual study. The two brothers would end up being called Methodists by fellow students because of the religious regimen that they adopted. Both students woke up early, studied their Bibles for hours a day, and started a prison ministry. The Wesley brothers developed a belief that conversion was the starting point of a relationship with God. Then, after conversion, a believer could seek out holiness and spiritual growth.
In 1735, at age 28, Charles decided to join his brother John in the colony of Georgia in America. He was officially an ordained missionary and worked as a secretary to Governor Oglethorpe, the governor of the Georgia colony. Charles's chief mission was to minister to the colonists and convert the American Indians to Christianity. His work in Georgia did not turn out to be a good experience. For an entire year, Wesley described his mission as an unfruitful period of ministry.
His strict methods clashed with the relaxed community that was established in Georgia. He refused to recognize lay baptism and sought extreme reform. Because of this, he was shot at, slandered, and shunned by the governor for whom he worked. And on top of all that, he became very ill. He boarded the ship back to England, anxious to get back, but regretted not being able to fulfill his Indian mission work. He was so distraught over the whole experience that he wondered if he was even saved himself. He considered himself an absolute failure in ministry. On the journey back to England, Wesley wrote, "I went to America to convert the Indians, but oh, who shall convert me?"
After his experiences in Georgia, Charles was struggling with his calling to mission work and even his own salvation. He felt something was missing. Charles continued his battle with debilitating pleurisy, in which his lungs became so inflamed that it made it difficult to breathe. And to make things worse, he was also sick with unbelief. While bedridden, Charles began reading Martin Luther's book on Galatians, and in his journals wrote, "I labored, waited, and prayed to feel who loved me and gave himself for me." A lady of the house of which he was rooming while sick said to him, "In the name of Jesus of Nazareth, arise and believe, and thou shalt be healed of all thy infirmities." That was the moment his heart changed, and he journaled, "I now find myself at peace with God and rejoice in hope of loving Christ." A couple days later, Charles wrote his very first hymn, celebrating his conversion. This first hymn ignited a great passion within him to capture the essence of Christianity into song.
It was this month, May 21st, 1738, on his sickbed, Charles experienced what could only be described as a miracle. He was instantly healed and he felt the Holy Spirit invade his body. He wrote in his journal that the Spirit of God chased away the darkness of his unbelief. He had finally found that the Holy Spirit was his missing piece. Wesley wrote that up until his conversion, he had believed in salvation on good works alone, an unconverted Christian attempting to convert people to Christ. But after this pivotal moment, he lived a life of faith and began to see a huge change in his ministry.
In England, the two brothers saw the famous revivalist George Whitefield begin to break conventional barriers by reaching the lost outside the church. The Wesley brothers were deeply inspired and began doing the same. Both John and Charles began evangelizing outside of the church. And like George Whitefield before them, the Wesleys began to see great numbers crowding their services. Many times there were so many people attending the service, it was impossible to count the attendance.
Of the rallies where attendance was taken, it's believed that the brothers had preached to nearly 150,000 people in 5 years. Twice in a span of 2 weeks, Charles reported their services totaling 10 to 20,000 in attendance. Crowds insanely large for the 1700s.
Charles and his brother John began touring England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, covering thousands of miles with the gospel message. Even though the two brothers were not often welcomed inside the church, they encouraged converts to attend their local parish church. Oftentimes, the Wesley brothers were kicked out of towns they would enter due to their zealous nature, but their resolve never wavered. Charles was convinced traveling missions was what they were created to do. Their mission was to speak and preach to whomever would listen.
While John was quickly becoming known as the preacher, Charles continued to write his songs and hymns. It was somewhat of a 1-2 punch. John with his sermons and Charles with his hymns. In fact, it should be noted that Charles Wesley's hymns enabled the learning of Christian beliefs through song, and many of them were written on horseback as he traveled throughout the country. He was bringing the gospel to everyone in a brand new way. Throughout his adult life, Charles wrote over 56 volumes of hymns, all of them based on the truths he found in Scripture. In the Wesley brothers' services, accounts describe attendees singing these hymns with exuberance. Charles quickly became known for his ability to capture the meaning and experience of Christianity in song and verse.
At age 40, Charles met and married his wife, Sarah. He continued to travel and preach until his health began to deteriorate. At 49, he made his last nationwide horseback trip. He would stay between homes in Bristol and London, preaching in Methodist churches. With less traveling, he spent much of his time writing. In 1788, his health failed, and in March, he was unable to keep writing. He died quietly on March 29, 1788, at the age of 80, leaving behind a wife, 2 children, and a lifetime worth of hymns and writings.
Charles Wesley is known as perhaps the most prolific hymn writer in English history. His ministry and his songs continue to impact the church even today across many different denominations. His life was a mission accomplished: to preach the gospel to whomever would listen, convert the sinner, and raise up revival through hymns of praise. Like our first revivalist, George Whitefield, our next one was also quite the entertainer. In fact, it is said that no other form of entertainment in the 1800s could have compared to a sermon from Charles Spurgeon. Many may recognize his name, but I bet you didn't know that he was one of Victoria England's most controversial preachers for being vulgar. In fact, Spurgeon once said, "I am perhaps vulgar, but it is not my intention, save that I must and I will make people listen. My firm conviction is that we've had enough polite preachers. His tenacious behavior behind the pulpit showed a fierce desire to reach people for Christ. It was this month in history, on May 3rd, 1850, a 15-year-old Charles Spurgeon made his public profession of faith in Jesus Christ. He preached his very first sermon at the age of 16 the following year and didn't stop preaching until his death 42 years later.
Charles Spurgeon was born in Essex, England, where his father and grandfather were ministers. Spurgeon recalled that he grew up with Pilgrim's Progress and Fox's Book of Martyrs on the shelves and frequently leafed through them to see the pictures inside. Even though his father was a minister, he broke away from the beliefs of his parents and decided to become a Baptist at age 15. He had, in fact, been struggling with his faith, alternating between searching for God and running away from the church. Then, one morning, a severe blizzard forced him from attending his own church and into the first church he could find, a primitive Methodist chapel started by the Wesley brothers. Spurgeon said of the man delivering the sermon that he was really stupid and could not even pronounce the words rightly, but somehow still caused Charles to look deeply into his own beliefs about salvation, including infant baptism. Even though he recalled the preacher as an imbecile, Spurgeon later said the preacher had looked directly at him and said, "Young man, you look very miserable. You always will be miserable in life and in death if you don't obey, but if you obey now, this moment, you will be saved." Spurgeon later wrote, "Between 10:30 when I entered that chapel and 12:30 when I returned home, what a change had taken place in me." Later, Spurgeon wrote, "That was the day he was saved."
After his conversion, Spurgeon searched for a congregation in line with his new beliefs. 4 months later, he was baptized and joined the Baptist church. His mother said that she had always prayed for him to find God, but didn't pray that he'd become a Baptist. Although Spurgeon remained a Calvinist, he gladly took the name Baptist as well. According to Spurgeon, his belief was simple. It was Jesus Christ. Spurgeon began preaching in the rural town of Cambridgeshire, England. His energy and verbal mastery grew his congregation until his small church was bursting at the seams.
Spurgeon would use a simple outline and would speak extemporaneously. It was said that he had an amazing memory, and word got around about Spurgeon's fantastic preaching style. Many reports say that he had a great energy when he spoke, having a great tone and quality to his voice. His reputation was growing so fast that he was invited to preach at the historic New Park Street Chapel in London, England.
New Park Street Chapel was London's largest Baptist church. Although the congregants reportedly loved his preaching ability and wanted him to stay, they couldn't afford to pay him a salary. But Spurgeon enjoyed preaching there so much that it didn't matter. So he officially moved there and never looked back.
After 3 months ministering at New Park Street, the congregation was thriving, and they soon grew too large for the 1,200-seat auditorium. The church decided to enlarge the chapel in order to facilitate the meetings. While they were remodeling, the congregation met at a larger facility, Exeter Hall. The public auditorium seated 5,000 people, one of the largest auditoriums at the time. In 1855, the renovations at New Park Street were complete, but at that time, it was again too small for the growing church. In 1855, Spurgeon began publishing his sermons under the title The Penny Pulpit. Stenographers would sit in the congregation and write down his sermon as he preached it. The following day, Spurgeon would review the notes, make edits, and then make them available to print. These penny pulpit sermons were sold for a penny each and were widely circulated. Every year, the sermons would be gathered up and published in book form, called the New Park Street Pulpit.
Spurgeon quickly became known for his writings as well as his preachings. He went on to publish several other books, most notably Lectures to My Students and Treasury of David, a devotional commentary on Psalms. Spurgeon's Penny Pulpit series remained one of the best-selling sermon series of all time. The news of Charles's abilities continued to spread, and he was invited to speak at more and more locations throughout the nation, not just in London. Spurgeon went on to preach to tens of thousands in some of England's largest halls. It seemed no auditorium was ever large enough to hold the amount of people who wanted to listen. Rooms would fill to their maximum to hear the preaching sensation of London.
In 1861, his congregation, which kept constantly expanding, moved to the new Metropolitan Tabernacle, which seated 5,600, the largest church in London at the time. His ministry grew by leaps and bounds, resulting in the founding of 66 parachurch ministries. As his ministry grew in financial success, he continued to give more and more to the church. By the age of 27, Spurgeon had donated more than a third of the $3.6 million required for the construction of the Metropolitan Tabernacle himself. He didn't take a salary from the church, but earned money from the sale of his sermons and books.
His sermons and writings were such a success, the London Times and the New York Times began publishing his sermons. But not everybody was impressed. In fact, Spurgeon's worst critics were from within the church. Traditional Protestants criticized him for his dramatics on stage, pacing the platform and acting out stories. He was scorned for including sentiment in his preaching, including stories of dying children, grieving parents, and repentant harlots.
Those who took offense started calling him the Exeter Hall demagogue and the pulpit buffoon. In response, Spurgeon said, "I am perhaps vulgar, but it is not intentional. My firm conviction is that we have had enough polite preachers." People were also critical of his unapologetic evangelism. When people would question his creed, Spurgeon simply replied, "It is Jesus Christ." Perhaps the thing that made Spurgeon loved and hated was the way he spoke. He had the ability to make things simple. Reports say that he always spoke plainly. He tried to make the gospel simple, not some high society theological debate. Spurgeon insisted that we must not put the fodder on a high rack by our fine language, but use a great plainness of speech.
Mark?
Nietzsche. Right? Is that how you say that? Nietzsche. Is it Nietzsche? Nietzsche? I thought it was Nietzsche. One notable sermon was on Acts 26:28, when he said, "Almost persuaded to be a Christian is like a man who is almost pardoned, but was hanged. Like the man who was almost rescued, but he was burned in the house. A man that is almost saved is damned." Spurgeon had serious conviction in his beliefs, which eventually caused quite the controversy.
In 1864, Spurgeon preached a sermon titled Baptismal Regeneration, which objected to Anglican teachings on the sacramental power of infant baptism. The transcribed version sold more than 350,000 copies. His outspoken attack on core Anglican theology caused a huge divide in the church. Spurgeon later decided to leave the Evangelical Alliance because of the falling out that ensued. Spurgeon was not afraid to take on controversial topics that he felt to be heretical.
Spurgeon publicly reprimanded other ministers for downgrading the faith during such a pivotal time in philosophical thought. Darwin had just published his book, Origin of the Species, and the idea of evolution was starting to spread. To make matters worse, Nietzsche was teaching that God was dead and to reconsider traditional faith and religion. This caused Christians all across Western civilization to reevaluate their beliefs. Spurgeon saw this tidal wave of secular thought sweeping Europe and warned church leaders of its consequences.
He advocated for the essentials of the faith and proclaimed them loudly. In his monthly publication, The Sword and the Trowel, Spurgeon said, "Our warfare is with men who are giving up on the atoning sacrifice, denying the inspiration of Holy Scripture, and casting slurs upon justification by faith. Watching people lose sight of the authority, inspiration, and inerrancy of the Bible broke Spurgeon's heart." As many believers began rejecting the resurrection of Christ, Spurgeon would not go silently. When the Baptist Union would not heed his advice to draft a statement of faith, he decided to resign from his position. When he resigned his post, he was censored by the denomination. Spurgeon, however, saw the future of a secular society and the ramifications for not standing up against it. He said, "I am quite willing to be eaten by dogs for the next 50 years, but the more distant future shall vindicate me." This prophetic statement certainly rings true today.
While Spurgeon was primarily known as the fiery preacher who preached to the masses, he did more than that. He established almshouses and orphanages. He believed that the gospel must be expressed through action as well as words. He believed that there was no better way to express Christianity than by feeding orphans. Subsidizing housing for widows, and funding the Home Rescue Society for women suffering from domestic abuse. Spurgeon's legacy lies within the emphasis to teach others. This pastor's college, founded in 1855, still exists today. This free seminary was designed to help rough-and-ready ministers sharpen their skills in ministry. Spurgeon exemplified Christian virtue in his ministry, leaving quite the legacy. In his lifetime, he preached to over 1 million people and personally baptized 15,000 new believers. His sermons were translated into almost 40 languages, which at the turn of the century is quite remarkable. Spurgeon's death on January 31st, 1892 was felt all throughout London. It's reported that nearly 60,000 people came to his wake at the Metropolitan Tabernacle. Around 100,000 people lined the streets as his body was taken to the cemetery. Businesses closed and flags flew at half-mast. London had lost one of its most passionate and influential revivalists. If you were asked the question, who was the most influential writer of the 20th century? The name Gilbert Keith Chesterton probably wouldn't rise above Tolkien, Lewis, or George Bernard Shaw. But each one of those men claimed Chesterton as a valuable friend and fearless defender of the Christian faith. In this month of history, one of the most prolific Christian authors and thinkers, G.K. Chesterton, was born in London in 1874. Growing up, Chesterton was fascinated with art and storytelling, and from a young age, he desired to turn his love for art into an occupation. While he never achieved his goal as an artist, he went on to later impact some of the greatest storytellers in history, including C.S. Lewis, H.G. Wells, and T.S. Eliot.
At the turn of the 20th century, just like Charles Spurgeon had predicted, Europe was rocketing towards rationalist thought and the rejection of a supreme being. Victorian England at the turn of the century was fascinated with the occult. The so-called New Age was a seductive lure for those who wanted to rebel against traditional religious systems. Seances were commonplace amongst the educated classes, and connecting with spirit energies was all the rage as Chesterton was coming of age. Chesterton grew up curious about life and all things spiritual. As a young man without any strong religious ties, Chesterton became fascinated with the occult and other supernatural phenomena. In his own words, he described an experience he once had with a Ouija board. He recalled, "I would not altogether rule out the suggestion of some that we were playing with fire, or even with hellfire." As the spiritualist and New Age movement swept through Western philosophy and religion, Chesterton struggled to determine his path in life.
After high school, Chesterton never went to college. His big break came when in 1900 he was asked to contribute a few magazine articles on art criticism. Those few articles launched his career, and he would eventually become one of the most prolific writers of all time. His style is unmistakable, always marked with humility, consistency, paradox, wit, and wonder. Chesterton used his unorthodox literary style to explain truths inside complex matters of politics and faith. He was known for taking a concept and flipping it inside out, providing different perspectives that would confound the greatest critical thinkers of all time.
T.S. Eliot wrote about his use of paradox, saying he concealed the most serious and revolutionary designs, concealing them by exposure. According to his contemporaries, Chesterton was a master of the English language and could write about anything and everything, which he did. Chesterton would not only be a great defender of faith against the turn-of-the-century new agnostic ideas, but go on to inspire the likes of C.S. Lewis, Ernest Hemingway, and even Gandhi. While Chesterton's writings are considered some of the most profound of the 20th century, he was also widely known for his abilities to cover and debate multiple genres and topics in writing. He would make a name for himself covering political and social subjects. But what made him famous was his ability to cross the aisle and debate those who he did not agree with in a humble, jovial manner. Chesterton engaged in debate frequently. He did so with some of the most famous people of his time, including H.G. Wells, George Bernard Shaw, and Hilaire Belloc. Even his debate opponents regarded him with the greatest respect and affection. The famous playwright George Bernard Shaw said, "The world is not thankful enough for Chesterton."
Chesterton was a paradox himself. This brilliant man usually had no idea where or when his next scheduled appointment was. In fact, his wife had to manage much of his life since he continually proved he couldn't do it himself. He did a majority of his writings in train stations since he somehow always managed to miss the train. In one famous story, Chesterton telegraphed his wife saying, "I'm at Market Harborough. Where ought I be?" She responded, "Home." He once said, "I'm not absent-minded. It is the presence of mind that makes me unaware of everything else." He approached life with humor. Once trying to exit his car door, he became wedged inside. With a grin on his face, he said, "I would have tried to exit the car sideways, but I have no sideways." The cape-wearing, sword-bearing, cigar-smoking 300-pound man left no subject serious. Even his apologetics, historical theory, and theological biography overflowed with humor.
Chesterton said, "Subject matters may seem dull as ditchwater," but added, "Naturalists with microscopes have told me that ditchwater teems with quiet fun." Although Chesterton was raised in the Church of England, he was quite fascinated with Roman Catholicism. Chesterton wrote that he believed in a personal God and in the Christian faith, but admired the spiritual discipline and responsibility of the Catholic Church. In 1922, he decided to visit Rome and converted to Catholicism. After this, he began writing books on denominational topics like Puritanism and the Reformation. He would also write on heroes of the faith like St. Francis of Assisi and St. Thomas Aquinas. His work on St. Thomas Aquinas is considered one of the premier works on the saint.
As the legend goes, Chesterton made his secretary check out numerous books on the saint from the library. When she returned with a stack of books, Chesterton opened the top book, thumbed through it, closed it, and then proceeded to dictate the book on St. Thomas. This book ended up being considered the best book ever written on the saint.
The French philosopher and historian Étienne Henry Gilson said, "Nothing short of genius can account for such an achievement." Chesterton was famous for pairing wit with a serious point and self-deprecation. His writings often contained great paradoxes for which he was famous. He saw paradoxes as supreme assertions of truth. It was his favorite ploy to articulate the nature of his subject. He once said, "The Bible tells us to love our neighbors and also to love our enemies, probably because generally they are the same people." Chesterton used paradoxes to even address social issues. Chesterton's book, What's Wrong with the World, talked favorably about distributism which divided landowners into smaller communities to attempt to bring about neighborliness. He thought it to be a counter to socialism and capitalism, which he felt reduced people to inhumane units. Critics often responded well to his writings, until they discovered the truth behind it.
Chesterton spent decades writing, debating, and teaching people about faith. By the 1930s, Chesterton was publishing his own magazine, and as radio shows began to grow in popularity, Chesterton broadcast a radio series. In his own unique style, he used parables and allegories to bring about understanding of social issues affecting Europe. In 1936, with his health in decline, he decided it was necessary to write an autobiography. The same year it was published, he passed away. He was 62 years old.
Upon his death, an outpouring of comments about his influence came from around the world. T.S. Eliot and H.G. Wells, both good friends of his, expressed their grief with his passing, and Pope Pius XI declared him a defender of the faith. Because of Chesterton's inspiration, Mahatma Gandhi nationalized India with a non-Western ambiance. George Orwell got the date 1984 from a novel of Chesterton's, and his apologetic works were pivotal in the conversion of C.S. Lewis. T.S. Eliot commented that Chesterton did more than any man in his time to maintain the existence of the Christian minority in the modern world. Over the course of his lifetime, he would author more than 4,000 articles, 100 books, and preach countless sermons. His writings were pivotal to the conversions of some of history's most influential apologists, and are considered foundational to argue against agnosticism and modern relativism.
Chesterton was able to see where modern relativism was headed. Now nearly 100 years or so since his writings, it's interesting to see how accurate he was about certain things. For instance, he rejected communism in the days before it became truly horrific. He wrote that socialism was an illusion controlled by a ruling few. He dejected Nietzsche's perpetuation of nihilism, claiming God was dead. He also stood opposed to materialism, scientific determinism, and moral relativism. Chesterton wrote for the common man because he loved common sense. He defended morality and ethics, but most importantly, he defended the Christian faith.